When she drew it out, a string of blood followed. It formed a character in front of her. This was a magic letter. It looked like Sanskrit or a rune. She gained this skill from one of her classes, Blood Drinker, called Blood Pool. It saved the blood of any slain enemies. The blood became a glob of malicious magic. She could then use it for various purposes. By sucking energy out of it, she could cast magic-boosting spells. She didn't need to use any additional MP. Penetrating Magic Implosion. Sholtia cast a Tier 10 spell, the highest tier of magic. This caused the bodies of 10 mercenaries to swell up. They didn't even have time to scream. They could only look down at their bodies. They realized something strange was happening and screwed up their faces in horror. The next moment, with the light popping noise of a balloon, they exploded. Ah ha ha, ha 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 ha, fireworks, so pretty. She pointed to the sprays of blood and clapped with a nasty grin on her face. You were og. The S-dog thrust at the same time as the roar pierced Sholtia's chest. It came out her back, about where her heart was. Then it wiggled up and down to widen the wound. Go to hell. Next, a broadsword was brought down into her head, cutting it in half. The blade stopped sticking out from her left eye. Keep it up. A war cry went up, mixed with shrieks and howls. 3 mercenaries swung their weapons at her. The swords were swung over and over. But even with a broadsword sticking out of her face, Sholtia was unfazed. She didn't seem to be experiencing the slightest pain. She just stood there with that abominable smile on her face. The mercenaries left their swords, fatigued from the multiple attacks. They continued hitting her with their fists and kicking her, tears streaming down their faces. Even though they were built bigger than her, she didn't budge an inch. They felt like they were beating on a giant rock. Sholtia cocked her head at them and began to think. Then, as if she came up with something good, she clapped her hands together. Haraha, she exhaled as if emitting built-up heat. A stiflingly thick smell of blood swirled through the area. She leisurely removed the broadsword from her own head. Of course, there was no wound left behind once it was out. About to wield it, she stopped. Rust covered the sword. It began to crumble. She threw it away, disappointed as she remembered. It was a penalty for one of her class's cursed night. Then she nonchalantly brandished her delicate hand. 3 heads rolled across the dirt. Run for it, hurry. There's no way we can win against that monster. Several mercenaries screamed as they all tried to flee. Sholtia grabbed the head of one whose will to fight was completely broken as he tried to run. She squished it with all her strength at once. With the crunching noise that sounded exactly like forcibly ripping off a crustacean's shell, his head was smashed and his brains splattered. Ah ha 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 ha, what with that fire ass? Are you scared? Ah ha 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 ha, wait up. Tag's not over yet. The bloodthirsty queen of nightmares laughed. You were not getting away at the men who, curiosity piqued by the strange noise, had turned and witnessed the sickening spectacle. Then she charged. A mercenary tripped over his own feet as he tried to flee and fell at Sholtia's feet prostrate. Please spare me, I beg you, I won't do anything bad ever again. He grabbed her feet, crying. She pasted a smile like a fissure across her face. He realized instantly what that meant. His face went past pale to white as a sheet. Up you go, Don T, oh please do un T. He clutched desperately at her feet. But she took hold of his back and hurled him lightly toward the ceiling. Having been unable to resist her strength, the mercenary lost his grip. He felt weightless for a couple of moments, his eyes shut tightly, then gravity kicked in. His hands hit the floor and pain shot through his arms. Engaya, pain was proof he was alive. Grateful for that, the mercenary cracked his eyes open and realized he had acted too soon. Sholtia had caught him gently in her slender arms. That was why his entire body hadn't slammed into the floor. He still hadn't escaped her, but more importantly, a huge mouth gaped before his eyes. He'd never smelled anything so foul it was like a glob of coagulated blood. Ah ha 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 ha, this is foo-one. Did you think I would let you lickety lick lick, help nu you don't I haven't had a drink in forever. Her mouth ripped past her ears with a pop and opened wide enough to swallow a human head whole. No one there knew what a dangerous monster the true vampire from the DMMO Yggdrasil was. Her extra wide mouth made a huge half circle. Her 2 upper canines extended past her chin. Her crimson eyes sparkled. Sharp nails, a couple of inches long, tipped her withered-looking arms and legs. She moved, almost stooped over, and pounced to attack. A regular vampire was like a mixed-blood human bat monster, and the elite race of original vampires looked even more like a monster. About the only vampires that could be said to be beautiful were vampire brides, like Sholtia's concubines. The only reason the true vampire Sholtia was beautiful was simply because the guild member who designed her was good at drawing and the 3D modeling happened to go well. This was her true form. In other words, her normal appearance was nothing but a front. She latched onto the mercenary's neck like one of those sticky rubber toys or a hideously fat leech. No sooner had he processed the sensation of his neck being punctured by numerous needles, or was it the vulgar noise of all his blood being drunk, he felt, with a chill, that he, as an entity, was being rapidly sucked out of his body. It was a horrifying sensation, unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. Even if he tried to struggle, his arms and legs felt heavy. His field of vision rapidly darkened. Eventually, Sholtia had drunk enough of him. She cast away the dried-up corpse, and then licked the fresh blood from the corners of her mouth with her long, slimy tongue. Then she grinned broadly at the scrambling mercenaries. "There are so many of you left." Countless screams, cries of enmity, and despondent wails echoed throughout the hall. A hush had fallen over the hall where nothing moved any longer, and Sholtia stood there smirking. The glob of blood floating above her had gathered quite a lot and was now just a bit smaller than her head. So much fun. The vampire brides, who had been tasked with preventing anyone from running away through the entrance to the hall, bowed their heads in reply to Sholtia's scream of delight. "If you're enjoying yourself, that's what is most important, Grand Mistress. My main dish." Sholtia put her strength into wrenching open the door Brain had escaped through. The lock popped out and the door, hinges and all, ended up in her hand. It was a small room, but there were many bags and wooden crates inside. And there was something she hadn't expected. Mixed in with the dust came the smell of fresh air, a breeze from outside. She simultaneously felt the presence of a human growing fainter. Even having lost herself in her blood frenzy, Sholtia still vaguely remembered her orders. Unleashing a cry of anger or war, she went after the presence, throwing the bags and crates out of her way. Behind all the stuff was a hole. It wasn't even a yard in, but it was filled with dirt and sand. Fresh air was streaming through a slight gap. An escape path, the lesser vampire hadn't lied. He just hadn't known about this escape route. It's an easily misunderstood fact, but even when charmed, a target can tell only what they know. They can say something they don't know, and if they were convinced something untrue was true, the charmer would acquire bad information. Unlike Mare, Sholtia didn't have any magic to move dirt out of the way. If she used a shock wave, there was a possibility the ceiling would cave in. He got away. When those words appeared in her train of thought, she understood, albeit vaguely, that she had failed part of her mission. She grimaced in rage. Why didn't worthless humans act how she, a guardian of the great tomb of Nazareth, wanted? She wanted to make his pointless life serve the glorious purposes of the great tomb of Nazareth. So why couldn't he understand that and rejoice? She was noisily grinding her teeth when she heard the voice of one of the vampire brides who had been stationed outside the cave. "Mistress Sholtia." For one moment, Sholtia's vision flashed red in annoyance. Perhaps she should have just destroyed the vampire bride if she couldn't even hold her position. But she frantically suppressed that anger. She could be spared if she was here with something important to say. "What is it?" "There are several people headed this way." Survivors." "Then shall we go out to meet them?" "Ah ha ha. Ah ha 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 ha." Sholtia jumped up. She leaped like a bird, taking off into the night, and alighted on one foot atop the logs that made up the barricade at the entrance. The vampire brides also slowly headed up to the entrance. Still smiling, Sholtia stared down her target. It was a party in tight formation. The vanguard was made up of 3 men, warriors. Their gear was all different, but they wore scale armor, had their weapons drawn in one hand, and wore large shields on their backs. Behind them was a woman warrior with red hair wearing banded armor. And behind her, walking as if he was under everyone else's protection, was a lightly equipped man with a staff, probably an arcane-type magic caster. Next to him was a faith magic caster wearing priestly garb over his armor. A sigil shaped like a flame hung from his neck. The 6 of them were astounded to see Sholtia, but they were not confused. They kept their guard up, a composure gained through experience. He knew what It was fine to kill humans who were as weak as tofu, but something with more crunch to it was definitely better. With anticipation in her crimson eyes, she smiled at them. It talked. The arcane magic caster was shocked, but only for a moment. His face hardened immediately. Assume it's a vampire. Only silver or enchanted weapons will work. We can win. Withdraw. Don't look at its eyes. He shouted in a loud voice that could be heard throughout the hollow. His orders conveyed the most important information, and the others reacted quickly. Warriors out front grabbed large shields off their backs and took up a defensive stance, holding them out. Their eyes strayed, focusing on Sholtia's chest and midriff. While that was happening, the woman warrior behind them took their weapons and began applying something. A faint but disagreeable odor drifted into Sholtia's nose. It was alchemical silver, a special liniment created by alchemists. When it touched a weapon, it made an oil slick, covering the weapon in a glaze with the properties of silver. Generally, silver weapons were more expensive, and their blades were softer than iron ones, so they were geared for long-term use. For that reason, many adventurers bought this liniment and applied the properties of silver as necessary for a limited time. Brandishing their temporarily silver weapons, they began their retreat while keeping the enemy in check. It was a magnificent retreat. All the party members moved smoothly, as if they were one creature. Our god of fire, don't push yourself, prepare defensive spells. Stopping the priest, who was about to hold up his sigil, the arcane magic caster began unleashing his own spells on the front line. The priest began casting as well. It depended on the class, but the majority of priests made use of the power of the gods to exorcise, subordinate, or annihilate beings, such as undead, demons, and angels. But they could do those things only to beings markedly less powerful than themselves. In other words, the priest had probably been about to attempt an undead exorcism. However, the arcane magic caster perceived the enormous power gap. He decided that if the priest had leeway to try that, his efforts were better used for something else, and he gave instructions accordingly. Thus, Sholtia picked out who the leader was and thought she should follow her orders and capture him. But the crimson urge to slaughter and see more blood flooded her mind. She wanted to kill and crush and dismember so badly. She wanted to bathe in blood. Froth gathered at the corners of her mouth as she panted. Evil protection, lesser psychic protection. The two casters bolstered the warriors in front with defensive spells, one by one. A feeling of admiration, however slight, was born inside Sholtia's maximally agitated mind. The spells they were using were the lowest level, tier 1, but they were appropriate for the enemy they were facing. These opponents were different from the mercenaries who just repeated thoughtless attacks at random. They were also different from the foolish warrior who faced her all alone, but couldn't even use martial arts. That said, their efforts were futile. In the face of the obvious gap in ability, their efforts meant nothing. Their adorable resistance was what finally snapped the thin thread of her self-restraint. It's no good, she shouted in an unhinged voice. I can't hold back any longer. She charged. She was so nimble. It was as if she were dancing, but anyone watching saw a gale force wind. Flowing seamlessly, her arm came up. She pierced a shield. She smashed armor. She ignored the magic defenses. She ripped apart skin, flesh, and bone. She clutched the heart that had just been beating, and all in one instant she ripped it out. Standing before the warrior who crumpled to the ground, Sholtia held out the throbbing reddish-black mass to show the rest of the party. The female warrior shrieked. The priest twisted up his face in loathing. Satisfied with the expected reactions, Sholtia grinned and cast a spell. Animate dead, the warrior who had lost his heart slowly stood up. He became one of the lowest tier undead, a zombie. But Sholtia wasn't done there. She swallowed the heart. Then she reached into the glob of blood above her head. When she pulled out her hand, inside was a beating clot of blood, a caricature of a heart. She threw it at the zombie. Wriggling like an insect and warping shape, it burrowed into the zombie's chest. With that, the body jolted. Then it still had full body spasms as it slowly transformed. His skin became like the bark of a withered tree, as if all the moisture had evaporated from his body. His nails grew suddenly longer, and his canine teeth jutted out. Soon, that undead creature was no longer a zombie. The adventurers were shocked by the appearance of the lesser vampire. This can be, I've never heard of a vampire using such high-tier spells without a penalty. It just happened right in front of us. Calm down. Stay cool and we'll handle this, but withdrawal is impossible. We'll take the offensive. Okay, the priestess' vague order caused some confusion. One warrior slashed at Sholtia, and another at the lesser vampire who was once their friend. Our god, god of fire, cast out the impure ones. Invisible holy energy radiated from the priestess' sigil. Of course, it had no effect on Sholtia. Ah ha 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 ha. One of the warrior's swords ripped into the lesser vampire, perhaps because it had been immobilized by the holy energy. It was probably vulnerable, since it was still unstable. It hadn't completely transformed from zombie into lesser vampire yet, but the fact that her creation was weak against the power of the gods was enough to irk Sholtia. She glared over at it dismally while fending off sword blows with her pinky finger. You are in my ye way ye. She swung her right hand in an offhand way. With that careless motion, the head of the warrior brandishing his sword was sliced off. He crumpled to the ground, neck spouting blood. Lesser strength, the priest gave the last remaining warrior a buff. Now the lesser vampire's dull movements were matched up against the magically enhanced warrior. The fight was going slightly in the warrior's favor. Well, it seems like they were having fun, so I won't bother them. Plus, there's still other prey, Sholtia thought, still thirsting for blood. She turned to face the priest. The woman warrior planted herself between them, holding her sword. It was only an iron weapon. How cute she was. Even twitching in fear, she did her best to take a combat stance. She looked like a little animal putting up a pitiful resistance. Sholtia felt a hot, erotic joy. How would she scream if I bit off her fingers? She could cut off her ears and make her eat them. No, she'd rather drink her blood. This was the first time she'd been outside and had female prey. ULLB dessert. She shouted with her mouth open wide and leaped. Her jump carried her easily over the woman. She landed in front of the arcane magic caster and priest. Faster than the priest could move, Sholtia gripped the hand that held his sigil and crushed it in one squeeze. Overwhelmed by the pressure, the bones crunched to pieces. The flesh and skin, with nowhere to go, were mangled. Jayarag. Satisfied with the sound of his scream, Sholtia kindly showed him some mercy. She thought she would relieve him of his pain. Her hand flashed. She nodded with pleasure as the blood spurting from the priest's neck was absorbed into the glob above her head. Then someone hit her from behind with all their might. But like a giant tree, Sholtia didn't budge an inch, though the sword sticking out of her chest was a little bit in the way. No way, it didn't work. This is a silver weapon. The woman practically half shrieked. She saw that Sholtia was still moving despite the sword piercing her chest right through her heart. The woman hadn't had a silver weapon. She must have picked it up off the fallen warrior. The things the caster had said were right, but they were also wrong. The only weapons that would work on Sholtia were those made of silver and imbued with a certain amount of magical energy, or equipment made of general materials but containing an overpowering amount of magical energy, or weapons of a certain attribute she was weak against. She wouldn't take damage from a mere silver weapon. Sholtia continued to ignore the woman behind her and stared down at the shocked caster. Magic arrow, he cast with a desperate look on his face. 2 shards of light flew at Sholtia and were easily neutralized. That was due to her skill, magic immunity. It had shortcomings that could be exploited depending on the ability of the attacking magic user, so it wasn't a perfect defense, but with such a large gap between their levels, she was practically invulnerable. In other words, the caster could do nothing against her. Woo-wooing, Sholtia swiped a hand, and the head of the one she lost interest in fell to the ground. When she turned around, the lesser vampire and warrior were still having a pretty good fight. Sholtia carelessly picked up the 2 fallen heads by their hair. As if bored, she threw them at the fighting pair. Each head weighed about 13 pounds and flew at an incomparable speed. The results barely needed to be spelled out. Both fighters crumpled to the ground. While Sholtia had been ignoring her, Dessert had been frantically stabbing her, cutting into her over and over. But what did she care? For Sholtia, who felt no pain, the woman's actions were meaningless. The only issue was the holes being ripped in her clothing, but since the outfit was magical, the damage would repair automatically as long as Sholtia was all right. Okay, time for dessert. Let us eat. Like a kid saving a favorite food for last, only with a sinister grin that would make anyone want to vomit, Sholtia turned on the woman with the sword coming at her from behind. Woman made momentary contact with Sholtia's crimson eyes before she realized she was the only one left standing. She backed up a step at a time, tears brimming. Then suddenly, she rummaged in her belt pouch to retrieve something. Sholtia watched, at ease in her red-tinted world. She was a tiny bit curious about what the woman was doing. Eventually, the woman took out a bottle and threw it. One glance was enough for Sholtia to smirk at the bottle as it flipped end over end toward her. The woman had surely meant to throw it seriously, but from Sholtia's point of view, it was moving just too slowly.